Can we prevent or even reverse chronic diseases such as type 2 diabetes or heart disease by changing our diet? In this video, we will look at a few studies that have put that question to the test. Hello everyone, my name is Mario, and on this channel we are talking about all things nutrition and health. This is the last video in this three-part series on why nutrition matters. In the first part, we talked about how common micronutrient deficiency diseases still are all around the world, illustrating that it is critical for a long and healthy life that our diet provides us regularly with all of the essential vitamins, minerals, and trace elements. In the second part, we discussed the currently ongoing global nutrition transition towards more and more industrially designed ultra-processed foods, and how that transition is strongly linked to increasing rates of obesity and associated diseases such as type 2 diabetes in populations all around the world. In this third part today, we will look at a few studies that provide evidence that nutrition is not just about meeting micronutrient needs or avoiding overeating, but that changing one's diet can prevent or even reverse common chronic diseases such as type 2 diabetes or heart disease. Now, I have picked these studies not because they are the most rigorous or best of the best. In fact, each of these studies is more or less flawed in one way or another. But I still felt that each provides interesting and inspiring insights. The first study I would like to talk about is the granddaddy of prevention studies, so some of you may have heard about it, the Diabetes Prevention Program, the main paper of which was published about 20 years ago. The objective of the Diabetes Prevention Program was to find out if the development of type 2 diabetes can be prevented in people who are at very high risk. They enrolled 3,234 participants with prediabetes. Prediabetes is basically a pre-disease stage where your blood sugar levels are no longer perfectly regulated and you have slightly elevated sugar levels in the fasting state and or after a meal, but it is not yet bad enough to be called diabetes. Men and women with prediabetes were randomized to either receive a placebo drug or a diabetes drug, metformin, at 850 milligrams twice daily, or a comprehensive diet and lifestyle modification program. That lifestyle program was designed to get people to eat a healthier diet, lose some weight and keep it off, and move more by regularly going on brisk walks. The lifestyle intervention was taught in person on a one-to-one basis where participants met 16 times with a case manager over 24 weeks. The emphasis of these 16 lifestyle change units was to get people to eat less fat and less junk foods, and to engage in moderate intensity physical activity for at least 150 minutes per week. And indeed, the investigators did manage to get participants to lose weight and keep that weight off, to some extent at least, over 4 years. Here, that line marked lifestyle shows that participants lost an average of about 14 pounds or 6.5 kilos in the first 6 months of the intervention, and even though they regained about half of it over the next 3.5 years, they were still weight reduced compared to baseline and also compared to the other two groups. The investigators also got participants to move more, as we can see in this graph here. Physical activity is shown in a weird unit called met hours per week, which is used by scientists to compare different types and intensities of activities. Participants in the lifestyle intervention group increased their physical activity by 6 to 8 met hours per week, which is equivalent to about 1.5 to 2 hours of brisk walking per week. Not all that much, but certainly a notable difference to the other two groups. In terms of the dietary changes, participants in the lifestyle intervention group ate fewer calories and less total and saturated fat. They ate a lot fewer sweets, less red meat and dairy, and they also ate fewer servings of grains. The only foods that participants ate notably more of were fruit and vegetables. So what was the effect of these lifestyle changes on diabetes incidence? Cumulative incidence here on the y-axis simply means new cases of diabetes that were diagnosed among those participants over the 4-year follow-up period. So at baseline, no one had diabetes yet, and then over time, some people developed diabetes. And we are seeing clearly that there is a separation here between the three groups. After 4 years, we see that about 37% of participants in the placebo group had developed diabetes, but only about 28% in the metformin group and only 20% in the lifestyle group. That is certainly a very notable difference. And by the way, in case this is unclear, the vast majority of these new cases of diabetes here would be expected to be type 2 diabetes. Let's be clear that we cannot attribute this entire effect to the dietary changes, because people also moved a bit more. But given the small increase in physical activity, it seems very likely that the dietary changes and the weight loss largely explain the substantial reduction in diabetes incidence. Now, this study certainly has had a major impact on how we view type 2 diabetes, namely as a disease that can largely be prevented by our diet and lifestyle. I will say, though, that the low-fat diet that was taught in this lifestyle change program is, let's say, a bit outdated. The program they used really focused mostly on cutting out fat and junk food, but gave little guidance on what to eat instead. Plus, today the case is being made with good reason, I think, that low-carbohydrate diets would be better for the prevention and treatment of type 2 diabetes than low-fat diets. So in other words, with what we know today, we should be able to prevent all or at least most cases of type 2 diabetes. But sadly, more than 460 million people are suffering from type 2 diabetes worldwide, and that prevalence is expected to increase further in the years to come. So what is it that made me say that low-carb diets would also be a good, maybe even better option for the prevention or treatment of type 2 diabetes? When we change our diet to prevent or reverse type 2 diabetes, we have one primary goal, and that is to lose some weight, and ideally keep it off. That is because the primary defects in sugar metabolism that lead to type 2 diabetes are caused by having too much body fat. Losing some weight and keeping it off will almost always improve our body's ability to regulate our blood sugar levels within the normal range. Losing some weight in the short term is usually achievable by any kind of diet. The problem is that most people quickly grow tired of constantly being hungry and therefore regain the weight they lost. It is therefore important to find a way of eating that will, help with that weight loss, but that we can also happily live with in the long term. Most evidence suggests that people tend to overeat calories whenever they are eating a lot of the hyperpalatable, highly seductive, energy-dense foods that are rich in both refined carbs and fat. Say donuts, muffins, cookies, cakes, pizza, ice cream, hot dogs, burgers, potato chips, or French fries. Or if you drink a lot of your calories in the form of soda, energy drinks, beer, or other alcoholic beverages. So one benefit of the dietary intervention in the diabetes prevention program we just discussed is that if people are asked to eat a low-fat diet and cut out junk foods, all of these foods are suddenly off limits. And instead, the foods they can eat are unprocessed, low-fat foods such as fruits and vegetables, beans and lentils, fish, lean meats, whole grains, potatoes or sweet potatoes. All of these are nutritious foods, but not hyper appealing if you eat them without huge amounts of added fats or oils. And so overeating becomes rather hard on these types of foods, and most people spontaneously lose weight. And, as the diabetes prevention program shows, they keep some of that lost weight off for years if they can maintain this low-fat diet pattern long enough. But what if you made a shift in your diet in the other direction, going high-fat but low-carb? Again, you cannot have most of these highly seductive foods here in the middle because while they are usually high in fat, they are also rich in sugar and other refined carbs. So instead, you'll be eating a lot of fatty meats, fatty fish, nuts and seeds, full-fat dairy, in addition to non-starchy vegetables. Well, you would also be expected to lose a bunch of weight, and as long as you stick to this low-carb diet, keep at least some of it off. There are plenty of data showing that people lose weight without even trying when they switch from a diet that heavily features those foods here in the middle to a diet that includes mostly the foods shown on the left side or the right side here. I'll provide some citations on the blog. For this video, let's stay focused on the question at hand, and that is whether such a low-carb diet could also be used to prevent progression from prediabetes to type 2 diabetes. I couldn't find an actual trial, but I found a 2-year single-arm study in which people with prediabetes at baseline were switched to a very low-carbohydrate diet. Now, in this study, people just received information and online support to follow a very low-carb diet. There were no in-person one-on-one meetings and no suggestion that people exercise more. And there were no other groups that would allow us to compare clinical outcomes to, as in the diabetes prevention program. The authors report that this very low carbohydrate diet was very successful in preventing progression to type 2 diabetes, because at the 2-year mark, only 3% of patients had developed manifest diabetes. Now, in the diabetes prevention program, about 22% of participants in the placebo group and about 8% of participants in the lifestyle intervention arm had developed diabetes at the 2-year time point. It would therefore seem that the cumulative incidence of 3% in this very low-carb intervention is encouragingly low. Unfortunately, that would be an overly optimistic conclusion. The problem is that in this very low-carb study, 33 of 96 participants, more than a third, dropped out of the study prior to the 2-year follow-up time point, and no data were reported on their clinical outcomes. Why is that a problem? Well, just imagine you were enrolled in a study like this, where many of your favorite foods are taboo. Would you be excited to do this for 2 full years? I guess the answer would probably be no, unless you saw some short to medium-term benefit from this sacrifice. If you lost some weight, or if you felt better, for example. But what if you didn't lose weight, or you were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in these 2 years of follow-up? Would that make you more or less likely to continue this diet? You would be more likely to drop out, right? And so what we need to assume is that the benefits from this very low-carb diet were less pronounced in those participants who dropped out. That is the reason why the standard in clinical trials is to conduct all analyses using the intent to treat method. In that method, you conduct your statistical analyses on all participants who were randomized, not just those who completed the study or those that followed the intervention diet exactly. That's the scientifically proper way, and that's also how the diabetes prevention program handled it. And that is also one reason why we should not be tempted to compare the 3% figure in this low-carb study with the cumulative incidence numbers seen in the diabetes prevention program. In other words, this study looking at the prevention of diabetes using a very low-carb diet is quite promising and suggests that this could be an alternative approach to the low-fat diet used in the diabetes prevention program. But the evidence is weak, and we clearly need actual randomized controlled trials that compare low-carb to low-fat diets to figure out if one is better than the other in preventing type 2 diabetes. What makes me pretty optimistic that low-carb diets will turn out to be an alternative option, or even better, for the prevention of diabetes are data from several randomized controlled trials in people with diagnosed type 2 diabetes. Let's just talk about one of these. This here was a randomized controlled dietary intervention trial in adults with type 2 diabetes who were randomized to either a low-carb diet or a low-fat, high-carb diet. Over 6 months on these diets, participants in both groups lost similar amounts of weight, roughly 26 pounds or 12 kilos on average in both groups. Notice that again this study was not analyzed according to the gold standard intent to treat principle because some people dropped out of the study and the authors did not consider these participants in their final analyses. Blood sugar control improved in both groups, but the improvements were a bit more pronounced in the low-carb group. For example, let's look at HbA1c, which is a major measure of importance in people with diabetes, because it gives us information about average blood sugar concentrations over several months. An HbA1c of 6.5 or more is used as a diagnostic criterion for diabetes, and so we could argue that if we manage to get HbA1c below 6.5, this would indicate remission or reversal of type 2 diabetes. In this study, 30 out of 47 participants who were randomized to the high-carb diet achieved HbA1c levels below 6.5% at the 6-month time point. That is a very respectable 64% of all participants. Among the 46 participants randomized to the low-carb diet, though, 36 achieved HbA1c levels below 6.5, so that is an even higher 78%. Now, I would only consider this true remission of diabetes if the HbA1c level of less than 6.5% was achieved without taking any diabetes medications. This was not the case in all participants in this study, so we cannot assume that all of these participants were truly in remission from their type 2 diabetes. However, what we can say is that their disease was at least very well controlled, which is important to minimize long-term risks such as cardiovascular disease. We can also say that the effectiveness of the low-carb diet was a little bit better than that of the high-carb diet. Plus, participants on the low-carb diet were able to reduce their use of diabetes medications more than those on the low-fat, high-carb diet. So they achieved a greater reduction in their HbA1c levels while also taking fewer diabetes medications. Quite promising. There are many more studies that have compared low-carb and high-carb diets for the treatment or management of type 2 diabetes. And by and large, they all show either that low-carb and high-carb diets are similarly effective, or that low-carb is slightly better. I'll provide some more information on the blog for those of you who are particularly interested in this topic. And we'll definitely have a lot of content in the future about diet and type 2 diabetes. So if this is of interest to you, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of that. To conclude this portion on diet and type 2 diabetes, what we can confidently say is that we have very solid evidence that we can prevent and probably reverse type 2 diabetes by changing our diet. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that diet is the only important factor. Exercising more can clearly also make an important contribution. Whether a low-carb or low-fat, high-carb diet is best is less clear, but my best guess would be that the most important dietary change is the one thing that low-fat and low-carb diets have in common: to limit those foods here in the middle that we talked about earlier, ultra-processed foods that tend to be hyper-palatable, added sugars from soda and sweets and baked goods, refined grains, and fried, energy-dense foods. There is good evidence that these foods trigger overeating and increase body weight. And even independent of that, these types of foods pretty likely have negative effects on our body's ability to keep our blood sugar levels within the normal range. Let's move to cardiovascular disease. Now, cardiovascular diseases are so common around the world that most of us think that it's normal to have a heart attack or a stroke at some point in our life. Several studies suggest that this doesn't have to be the case, and I would just like to highlight two particularly interesting ones. I'd like to start with an experiment led by a former surgeon, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn. In the mid-1980s, Dr. Esselstyn developed the idea that total serum cholesterol levels below 150 milligrams per deciliter would halt or even reverse coronary heart disease. He proceeded to recruit a small group of highly motivated people, 24 initially, who had severe coronary artery disease. He convinced them to change their diet to prevent further progression of their heart disease, and they all agreed to follow a very low-fat diet with less than 10% of energy from fat, consisting mostly of whole grains, legumes such as beans and lentils, vegetables and fruit. With the exception of non-fat milk and yogurt, animal foods, including meat, fish and eggs, were not allowed, and neither were nuts or oils of any kind. Dr. Esselstyn calls this plan a low-fat plant-based diet. Now, this is obviously a very extreme diet, and so 6 of the 24 participants dropped out of the experiment within the first 2 years. The remaining 18 who committed to the experiment in the long term were in pretty bad shape when they started to work with Dr. Esselstyn. Collectively, they had experienced 49 coronary events in the 8 years prior to the start of the experiment. And given their advanced age and advanced heart disease, one would have expected most of them to have more heart attacks in the near future. What happened instead was that none of them had any additional heart attacks. Only one of them died from arrhythmia, and 17 of the 18 were still alive 12 years later. I completed my PhD at an institution in Germany that specialized in heart disease. And if you had shown me the clinical data of these 18 people at baseline, I would have guessed that most of them would have at least one additional heart attack over 12 years, and that at least some of them would have died from their advanced heart disease. The fact that none of them had a heart attack and 17 out of 18 were still alive 12 years later is nothing short of amazing. Now, when I first read these papers describing this experiment, I initially discarded them as more or less worthless, because this is a clinical investigation that didn't adhere to most scientific standards in terms of conduct or reporting of clinical studies. I don't think we need a detailed discussion of all of these issues here. I do need to emphasize several quick points, though, that I want to make sure everyone understands. First, this was not a randomized controlled trial, so participants were not randomly assigned to one of several treatment arms. Instead, everyone was enrolled into the same diet group. This raises several issues, most importantly, that we don't have a comparison group. It's therefore hard to know what would have happened if these participants had not followed the prescribed low-fat plant-based diet, but had interacted in exactly the same way with the investigators while following some other diet. Second, this experiment didn't analyze outcomes using the intent-to-treat approach that I mentioned earlier as being critical in these types of studies. And actually, in one of the papers, the 6 participants who dropped out are used as a control group, which certainly is not appropriate. The third point is that the low-fat plant-based diet was not the only intervention here. Instead, all patients here were also on lipid-lowering medications, such as statins. I don't think that's a major problem, and quite frankly, lipid-lowering medications or not, most of these participants would almost certainly not have done as well as they did on medications alone. But this is still important to understand. It's unclear, and I would think unlikely, that dietary changes alone could reverse such advanced heart disease. So why did I decide to talk about this experiment here if it has so many limitations? Well, as much as there are a lot of things one can criticize about the design of the experiment itself and the reporting of it in the paper, the results are hard to argue with. Even if we consider that the health benefits of a low-fat, plant-based diet on coronary heart disease risk may look better here in this experiment than they actually are, the data are still pretty amazing. I mean, unless the investigators made up stories, which I don't believe, I feel comfortable concluding that the experiment strongly suggests that a combination of lipid-lowering therapy and the low-fat, plant-based diet they prescribed here was associated with an arrest of clinical heart disease. That alone is very important and noteworthy. Now, would I wish that an actual high-quality randomized controlled trial was done to put this to a more rigorous test? Yes, absolutely, because I'd like to gain a higher level of confidence that this particular low-fat, plant-based diet actually does arrest coronary heart disease. I would also be extremely curious to figure out whether the assertions of the authors are correct that it is critical to eliminate most fat and most animal foods. Personally, I would guess that including, say, fish or nuts, lean meats, or an oil such as olive oil would not make this diet much worse for heart disease. Maybe even better, or at least more feasible for most people. Now, why do I feel that way? Let me show you some data from another, more recent study, the PREDIMED trial. PREDIMED was a much higher quality dietary intervention study to test the hypothesis that a Mediterranean diet with either extra olive oil or extra nuts can prevent a first major cardiovascular event, such as a heart attack or a stroke. This was actually a randomized controlled trial conducted in 7,447 Spanish men and women who were at high cardiovascular risk. At the beginning of the trial, participants were 55 to 80 years old with an average of about 67 years. Most were either overweight or obese, but none had had any prior heart attack or stroke or other major cardiovascular event. These 7,447 participants were randomly assigned to one of three intervention groups. Two groups were asked to follow a Mediterranean diet, and one was asked to follow a low-fat diet. Participants in these two Mediterranean diet groups were given mostly the same recommendations. Eat plenty of fresh fruits and vegetables, fish, especially fatty fish, legumes such as beans and lentils, and dress vegetables, pasta or rice with a sauce called sofrito. Sofrito is basically a tomato sauce with onions, garlic, herbs, and plenty of olive oil. They were also asked to replace red and processed meat with white meat that contains less fat, and interestingly, habitual drinkers were explicitly asked to drink wine with meals. Soda, commercially baked bread and pastries, sweets, spreaded fats such as butter or margarine, and red and processed meats were specifically discouraged in both of these groups. The only difference between the two Mediterranean diet groups was that in one group, participants were specifically asked to consume more than 4 tablespoons of olive oil per day, and in the second group, participants were asked to consume at least 1 serving every day of nuts. So basically, we have two groups following a high-fat Mediterranean diet pattern, one specifically enriched in olive oil, and the other enriched in nuts. These two intervention groups were then compared to a control group that was asked to follow a low-fat diet. Participants in this group were specifically told to consume at least 3 servings per day of low-fat dairy, at least 3 servings per day of bread, potatoes and pasta, lean fish and seafood, and plenty of fresh fruit and vegetables. They were told to limit their consumption of vegetable oils, including olive oil, nuts and fried snacks, red and processed meats, fatty fish, spreaded fats, commercially baked bread and pastries, sweets, and sofrito. Participants were followed for almost 5 years. What was the impact on cardiovascular disease? Did people in the Mediterranean diet groups have less or more heart attacks and strokes? If Dr. Esselstyn was correct that it is critical to keep fat intake as low as possible, then surely a change in diet towards more fatty foods could not be good, right? Well, no. The two high-fat Mediterranean diet groups actually experienced an about 30% lower risk in the combined endpoint of heart attack, stroke, and cardiovascular death. Now, to some of you, this may seem like a small difference, but consider that the dietary changes in the 2 Mediterranean diet intervention groups were fairly small as well, and probably pretty pleasant with more olive oil or nuts, regular wine with meals, and more of this delicious oily tomato sauce. And the benefits would likely become more substantial over time. Again, this study had a few issues that I'll cover in more detail on the blog. But ultimately, this study does again suggest that we can affect our risk of cardiovascular disease quite substantially by changing what we eat. It also suggests that removing as much fat from our diet as possible isn't the only thing we can do to lower our risk. And maybe it isn't about total fat at all, but specific types of fat that we should be limiting. Well, then, what do we learn from all of these different studies? They all showed that to some degree, we can reduce our risk, entirely prevent, maybe even reverse type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease. It's a bit confusing, though, that all of these studies used totally different diets, isn't it? So did I just make this video to confuse everyone as to what a healthy diet looks like? No, actually, my main objective with this video was to convey 3 points. First, to show that our diet can have a very substantial and very concrete impact on our risk of having a severe clinical disease. I certainly feel very motivated to eat well to not develop diabetes or heart disease, and I think all of these studies provide more or less good evidence that eating well is worth it. Second, I wanted to show that there's no one healthy diet. I'd say that taken together, the research we discussed along with numerous other studies suggests that people can be healthy eating a wide variety of diets as long as the majority of the food consists of unprocessed or minimally processed, nutrient-rich whole foods. And third, the research we discussed in this video is informative about what we should not be eating too much of. If you paid attention, you will have noticed that in all studies, either explicitly or implicitly, certain foods were discouraged. These include products rich in refined grains and often also added sugars and oils such as white bread, donuts, cookies, cakes, pastries, or breakfast cereals. Fried foods such as potato chips or French fries. Sugar-sweetened beverages. Sweets and ice cream. And you may notice that there is a lot of overlap of these foods with those ultra-processed foods we discussed in our last video in relation to the global obesity epidemic. So, from whatever angle we look at it, it would seem that we should consider these types of foods up here as occasional indulgences and make sure that the largely unprocessed, nutrient-dense foods shown here at the bottom of the chart are the staples of our diet. And I would suggest as a key takeaway from this video that as long as we do that, it may be secondary whether our diet is mostly low-fat or low-carb or has a mixed macronutrient composition. So the main overall take-home message of this video and our entire series on why nutrition matters is that we have plenty of scientific evidence that suggests that we do well to eat whole, largely unprocessed or minimally processed foods that are nutrient-dense. As we discussed in these past 3 videos, such a diet would minimize the risk of micronutrient deficiency diseases, minimize weight gain throughout our life, and reduce our risk of major chronic diseases such as type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. That, to me, is the very basic foundation of healthy eating that, I think, most professionals and researchers in this field would agree with. And in that framework, we can find a diet that we can happily live with in the long term. That's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. If you did, please leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're interested in this type of content. I hope to see you again for the next video when we'll revisit the topic of ultra-processed foods and their link to overeating and weight gain. And we'll talk concretely about how to identify and stay away from these ultra-processed foods. Until then, take care.